the national insurance is being raised, it would seem, in order to help pay for social care, something that has angered a lot of Conservative backbenchers, it's fair to say, and indeed, if the papers were to be believed yesterday, cabinet ministers as well. Ryan Shorthouse joins us, director of the centre-right supporting think tank Bright Blue. He's a former Conservative policy advisor. Thank you for coming on, Ryan. First of all, on the actual changes themselves, do you think increasing national insurance is a fair way to help pay the costs of social care?
No, I think it's the wrong choice. Although I would start by saying, polling seems to support the idea that people, say, above other forms of taxation, like income tax or inheritance tax, would prefer national insurance. And I think that's because there is an association with national insurance on particular health or welfare needs. It's this idea that, you're paying something into the system and you're getting something out, despite the fact that it's not quite a wonkish term, but it's not hypothecated.
Nope.
So it's not as if you pay that national insurance and it directly goes on health and social
care. The Treasury
care.
hate that.
They do hate that. They don't like, being kind of ring-fenced in terms of the funding that's coming through taxation or national insurance. So, I can understand why the government are going for national insurance, because people do associate it with that and it's quite popular, despite the fact that if they did raise the revenue in that way, it wouldn't actually necessarily mean that it would definitely all go on social care. It would just go into the general pot.
Yep.
So, yes. But having said that, having realised politically why they're doing it, why I'm against it in policy terms is because it, at a particularly vulnerable time coming out of COVID, it is obviously taxing both employees and employers. National insurance is a tax on work and earnings. And in fact, national insurance is excludes things like income that you get from pensions, which obviously income tax you do pay on pensions. So it's actually very targeted at working age people. And, if people want to get their income from pensions, dividends, tend to be people on slightly higher incomes, they will be excluded from this. So the optics don't look good, because basically the working age population paying for an injection of cash for essentially people who are baby boomers, pensioners who are not paying for it at all. So the recipients of it are not really contributing a huge amount. So I think the optics are not good there.
Well, two things on that. Firstly, I expect that many of the pensioners listening to this programme tonight might say, well, hang on a minute, I've paid in for God knows how long, so I have done my bit. And secondly, I saw a statistic that suggested that around half of all social care is actually delivered to people under the age of 65. So the young paying for the old argument might fall down a bit or take quite a large knock once it's shown, as the King's Fund did, that a lot of social care spending and a lot of people that need social care are actually under the age of 60.
That's true. That is true. And, I won't deny that. But what I'm saying is that obviously the people contributing to this now will be the working age population, whereas the people who are receiving it is every form of the population. So it seems to be a mismatch there. I think let's socialise the costs, but the people contributing, maybe that should be all of the population if we're truly going to socialise the costs of it, to kind of match the fact that the beneficiaries will be across the population as well.
Fairness is in the eye of the beholder, of course, but to your mind, Ryan, is this method of paying for social care more or less fair than Theresa May's attempt to try and work out what the hell to do with funding social care?
I think it's less fair.
Fair?
Yes, I think it's less fair than Theresa May's. Here's why. I mean, at the moment, obviously, the costs of social care, unlike the NHS, are very much a lottery, and it's very much an individual risk. You could land with quite high care costs. Even people on very modest incomes with modest assets, what's called the floor, so the amount in assets that you have is 23,000, I think, thereabouts. And if your assets drop below that, you can get free state care. Anyone above that has to contribute. Now, that's quite a low level of assets. And if you become particularly dependent on care, you could pay a lot of money and be on very modest income. So you're taking a huge risk. So it does make sense to socialise that cost in some way, to kind of, just like insurance schemes do, but taxes on a bigger scale, to make sure that, kind of a larger group of people are contributing a smaller amount. But what I think Theresa May's plan did, and also Andy Burnham's before that, which was called a death tax, Theresa May's was called a dementia tax, was to actually put the increased tax, the socialisation, on inheritance, on assets rather than earnings. And to be honest, I just, I do think it would be worth looking more at assets, because the value of assets, particularly from housing, but also from quite generous pension schemes, have really skyrocketed, and the rate of taxation which applies to those different forms of asset is not really caught up. So I agree with socialising some of the costs for care more, particularly for those on modest income. So it's not so much of a lottery and a burden on individual people, but I would rather socialise that more through taxes on assets and inheritance rather than earnings, particularly at a vulnerable time in the economy.
Well, at least when it comes to guarantees, Boris Johnson's guarantee that no one would have to sell their home to pay for the cost of care may well ring true if it is only national insurance that increases to go to pay to that cost, and assets aren't taken into account, perhaps. Just finally on the politics of this, Ryan, do you think people care that the Prime Minister is about to break one of the guarantees, or seems to be about to break one of the guarantees he made the electorate in 2019?
Yes, I do. I think
you're wrong. I don't think people care.
Okay, all right, I'll tell you why.
Go on.
Because in my opinion, my humble opinion, it was quite a slim manifesto, but that really stood out, not raising taxes on income, national insurance, VAT. And if you look at politicians who have broken promises before, think Nick Clegg on tuition fees, and I think George Bush was also, when he talked about read my lips, we will not put up taxes, and then later did, I think, and later tried to. I think there can be political consequences from that. However, acknowledging your point, it may be that people think, well, we've lived through quite exceptional times with COVID. And, the whole landscape has changed, particularly fiscally, so we can understand what government's doing. So
I think there is a bit of that, but I actually think most people don't know what's in the manifestos. Most people don't read what's in the manifestos. Most people don't hold politicians to what they've said in any manifestos. It's remarkable to me that Boris Johnson felt he could guarantee that, even though his own thin manifesto did say that he wanted to solve the problem of social care, and it struck a lot of people at the time, how on earth are you going to do that without having to raise one of those three taxes? But nevertheless, I think a lot of this stuff, particularly around Boris Johnson, seems to be, because he's the man who's Prime Minister, priced in.
Well, yes, he does seem to get away with a lot more than most of us would, certainly professionally, in our professional lives. But having said that, sometimes I agree with you, most people don't read the small print of manifestos, but sometimes there are manifesto commitments which are broken totemic, and become very high profile and quite totemic. So, who knows whether this one will break through, but there's a good chance that it will, and particularly when it comes to your finances, your personal finances, which obviously tax is about, people can obviously get very angry with it, and it feels very personal and affects you quite deeply. So, my view is that it is politically risky for the Prime Minister to proceed with this, and I think there are other ways of raising taxation, and I think, like I said, I think there's a case for socialising the costs more for people on modest incomes, injecting more funding for state social care, but I wouldn't have started with national insurance. I would have looked at inheritance, capital gains, things like that, pockets of money where you can make changes in different forms of taxation, which could have helped, and I think would have been less high profile and risky.
Very good to speak to you. Ryan Shorthouse, director of the centre-right supporting think tank Bright Blue, a former Conservative policy advisor. So two